Chapter 4, Homeowner Rehabilitation Activities. We're going to be talking through the activity-specific requirements, both the HUD requirements and the ADFA requirements for this, which is one of the 4 home-eligible activities. So we covered in some of the earlier sections, we have some rules that are for the home program that are home program-wide. So they apply to every activity that you would undertake. And then our activities themselves fall under 2 different sort of subcategories of either homeowner activities or rental activities. In this module, we're going to be talking about our homeowner rehabilitation rules. They're a little simpler than you'll see in the middle 2 boxes for home buyer and rental. Because we're doing development in those activities and we have affordability periods, those are a little bit more complicated. Luckily for us today, on the homeowner rehabilitation activities, it's a little simpler. We have our program-wide rules and generally just our home-specific for homeowner rehabilitation. So the eligible recipients of the ADFA funds are both units of local government. The HUD term that we would use on this would be state recipients because they are receiving funding from the state PJ, but also public agencies and other nonprofits could be eligible under the ADFA program to serve as subrecipients. So they'd be running a program on behalf of the state. One of the things to note here that homeowner rehabilitation is not an eligible CHOTO set-aside activity. So under the CHOTO activities, all of the set-aside activities are developing units in one way or another. So either building new units or taking existing units and rehabbing them, bringing them up to standards, and then selling them or renting them. In this case, we're going to be assisting existing households in existing units. And so it does not have that development criteria that would potentially have made it eligible as a CHOTO set-aside activity. ADFA has adopted some performance standards to make sure that these projects get up and running, that they are moving forward. And that's part of the home program's push, since this is a housing production program, to make sure that ADFA is committing money and then these projects get started and begin to provide benefits to income-eligible households. So the ADFA performance standards are the start on the count on this is from the receipt of the notice to proceed that each state recipient or subrecipient would receive from ADFA. And from that point, within 90 days, 25% of the allocation needs to be expended. 75% of that allocation needs to be within a 1-year period, and then 100% within 18 months. So it becomes important as an applicant for the funds to make sure that your program design is in place, that you are ready at the point that you receive that notice of to proceed to get your project up and running and begin to commit those benefits and see those dollars expended as described in your program design. For this category, we're going to be assisting income-eligible owner-occupants with needed rehabilitation to bring those units up to the applicable standards. So we can make alterations, modifications. Many of these are going to be based on health and safety improvements that are going to be made on those projects. We'll be talking in a minute or 2 about the standards more specifically, including the written rehabilitation standards that ADFA has put in place. For those of you that may have worked with other programs, one of the key things to understand about the home program is that when you assist a property, when you work on a home-assisted unit, that when you have completed it, you will have brought the entire unit up to standards. So some of you may have worked with other programs such as Community Development Block Grant Fund, CDBG, or other funding sources that would allow you to do targeted repairs. So you might have been able to go in and just fix a roof that was leaking or replace a heating system without inspecting all of the unit and being able to bring that up to standards. Under the home program, any property that we touch, we will have to bring the entire property up to our property standards. So those standalone programs you might see with other funding sources, like going in and doing weatherization or energy efficiency improvements to a property, or just doing an emergency repair where you deal with only one or two systems with a structure, or things like handicap accessibility, where you're making some modifications to that unit, but you're not addressing all of the other systems. Those are not eligible as a standalone project. They can be eligible as part of a owner-occupant rehabilitation. So you might be, let's say you were going to do a rehabilitation on a household where you had a mobility impaired individual in that household. You might make some handicap accessibility improvements so that that unit would function more appropriately for that household. You might be making some weatherization adaptations to make that unit more energy efficient, more comfortable for that household, but it would be part of your overall scope, which would bring the entire unit up to the required standards. Talk a little bit about the forms of assistance. The home program itself provides a lot of options on this. ADFA has selected for its homeowner rehabilitation program that these are going to be grants that'll be in place with no requirement or expectation of repayment. And so that keeps things very simple for you and for ADFA. It means that you do not have to place liens on the property or other assets and be able to track that over time, deal with payments. So it's very simple, going to be a grant-based program. Let's talk about some of the eligible costs. The home program has some specific language about things that home makes allowable or unallowable, and those include things like luxury items, also includes off-site infrastructure. So I'll give you examples on both of those. So an example of a luxury item might be a spa tub or maybe a wine refrigerator for the kitchen or something like that would be considered a luxury item and would not be something that would be an eligible use of home funds. Off-site infrastructure, so anything that's on the actual site for our home-funded project would be allowable, and that would be up to and connecting into something in the public right-of-way. So for instance, if we needed to replace the water line that went from the house and connected into the public infrastructure in the right-of-way, that would be allowable as part of a home-funded project cost. But the cost to maybe take from the public right-of-way and down the street to where it hooks into the main trunk line, those sort of modifications, because they are not on that site, would not be something that would be eligible for home funds to be utilized for. So it may mean that in some of your projects, you'll need to be clear on where those infrastructure investments are being made and whether they are in the public right-of-way or on the particular property that you're assisting. Just a little bit of a clarification. In the early days of the home program, it was not clear whether things like air conditioning, dishwashers, landscaping were allowable or not. And HUD has since then clarified that no, those are perfectly allowable under the home requirements, and ADFA has also adopted that. One ADFA restriction that I need to clarify, and this follows with the home rule itself. When you are rehabilitating an existing house, that attached garage is eligible if it's rehabbed along with the unit. It would not be something that would be eligible if you were just addressing the attached garage and not dealing with the rest of the unit. If we have a detached garage, it's only eligible if it's rehabbed with the unit, so it's a housing rehab program, and the reason that we are addressing that garage is because there are health and safety issues that have been documented and need to be addressed as part of that scope of work. So you need to make sure, as part of your documentation in your file for a homeowner rehabilitation project, that you're designating, if part of your scope of work includes a garage, you're going to want to note whether it's attached and part of a larger rehab project. And if it's a detached garage, you'll want to carefully show that it's being done as part of the rehab with the unit and the health and safety issues that make it eligible under the ADFA program. That documentation would need to be contained within your file. Also, things that would be included would be any of the soft costs that might be related to that project. And we're going to talk a little bit later in this section, a little more specifically about how we define what those costs would be that would be included in this. I also mentioned that relocation, if we were dealing with relocation, could be something that would be eligible. So for the HUD program itself allows recipients to cover their cost of administering the home program in several ways. Out of the overall allocation of home funds, 10% of those funds can be used by the PJ, which in this case is ADFA, to cover administrative costs, and that's covering costs for both ADFA and also for their subrecipients. But the other way to be able to cover those expenses is they can be charged off when eligible as a project-related soft cost. ADFA has put some additional restrictions in place to make sure that this is going to be done correctly. So ADFA is going to be looking at the combination of the program administration funds and the project-related soft costs and making sure that they fit within that 10% of the allocation that's being provided to the recipient. Keep in mind that costs that are going to be reflected as project-related soft costs have to be directly associated with home units. So you'd have to be able to break those costs down and show how they were attributable to specific home units. So it might be that, let's say you were getting maybe some kind of a pest inspection done or an appraisal's done, and you're going to be billed by that vendor for multiple units. They would need to break down each of the units in their invoice so that you could track those costs and be able to show how those costs that you were charging off were directly related to home assisted units. In those costs, they might be something that are going to be prorated across the assisted units. So one way or another, you're going to have a methodology of showing how those costs are related and how you've divided those costs. There is the requirement of a certification of costs, and there's a form that can be found online at the ADFA Arkansas government site. Linkages are being provided as part of this, and you would utilize the ADFA form to be able to provide certification of the costs that were being included. Keep in mind that the actual subsidy that's being provided to each of the units is generally going to be subject to cost allocation and subsidy layering analysis. Those functions are going to be handled by ADFA themselves rather than being a responsibility of you to be able to undertake. They probably will be less part of a homeowner rehabilitation project as cost allocation and subsidy layering might be for some of the other projects. So because ADFA is handling some of the required underwriting and cost allocation process, they need to be made aware of any changes that occur in that project. So if the total number of units that were going to be addressed, or the development costs, or the financing sources, so maybe some additional funding is made available, or there's a reduction in some case, all of that needs to be, ADFA needs to be notified because they may need to recalculate and recheck those numbers to make sure that they're going to be still in compliance with that project that's changed a little bit. For eligible property types, it's single-family housing and would also include condominium units. So as part of your documentation for your program, you would need to be able to document in each file the type of housing unit that's being addressed. As we're thinking about our eligible property types, we also need to make sure that that housing, this is homeowner occupied rehabilitation, that property is actually owned and occupied by the income eligible homeowner that's going to be applying for that program. So we're going to need to be able to document ownership of each of the properties, and we're going to also document that that household is income eligible. We talked in the earlier section about our income requirements, looking at the income for all of the household members. That would need to be compared against our 80% and below area median income to make sure that this owner qualifies as an income eligible household. Keep in mind that ADFA has clarified for this project, rental properties are not eligible under this. So we are dealing with low income eligible owners for the properties that they're occupying. And there is a requirement that they are occupying that as their principal residence. Generally, that means that the majority of the year they are occupying that unit, as opposed to maybe they're spending more than half of the year in some other part of the country. If you have questions about whether that property qualifies as principal residence, I would recommend that you work with the ADFA staff before proceeding in assisting that household when there's any question on that. The way we're going to document ownership is making sure that it meets one of the following criteria. Either fee simple title, so they have deeded ownership to this property. It could be a 99-year leasehold interest, probably not something that you're likely to see much of in your program. We could have, the home program also allows for 50-year leaseholds for trusts or restricted Indian lands. It could be an owned and occupied inherited property or a life estate where the individual has transferred ownership but has a life estate right to occupy the property for the rest of their life. There also is some additional definition under the home regulations of an inter vivos trust or living trust, where individuals living in the unit are low income and have the documented right to be able to occupy that unit, which is somewhat similar also to a beneficiary deed. Things that are not going to be eligible, and this is a HUD requirement as opposed to an ADFA requirement. HUD does not consider a land installment contract or a contract for deed as being an eligible form of ownership. Essentially, that individual, the transfer of the deed into that household's name does not happen until they have completely paid off that property. So if they are under a land installment contract or contract for deed and they're applying to you, they still don't own that property, and so they would not be eligible for this program. The additional ADFA requirement is they want to make sure that each of your applicants for the homeowner rehab program are current on their real estate taxes so that they don't have delinquencies in place, which would make that property at risk and the ADFA investment in that property at risk. So that would be one of the things that you would need to document as part of your intake process, that these applicants are in good standing. The home program imposes maximum property values. And essentially, home wants to make sure that with their investments, they're investing in modest units. And so as part of trying to measure, what's a modest unit, they set some maximum values in place. And so when we're evaluating whether a home that we are looking at assisting meets this criteria, we have to look at what the post-rehabilitation value would be and make sure that it does not exceed the HUD designated 95% of median purchase price for the area. There are existing limits that are put in place that ADFA will provide in conjunction with HUD as part of that. And so on the front end, before you were able to determine whether you could assist a household, you would have to make a calculation of what that post-rehab valuation would be. So every one of those property calculations is going to have to be done individually, and there are a couple of methodologies that HUD and the home program have said would be acceptable on how you make that calculation. You could have an appraisal done. So you could say to the appraiser, I want you to appraise what the after rehab valuation would be, and you would provide him or her with that scope of work. So they would look at the existing unit, they would make adjustments in value based on your proposed scope of work for that project, and they would provide you with a written appraisal of what that post-rehabilitation value would be for that property. A less formal process, HUD and ADFA would allow you to use an informed staff member who's going to come up with a valuation for that property. Now, that doesn't mean that you could say, you know, there's nothing on that side of town that's worth more than $150,000. It has to be a property-specific valuation, and there needs to be a basis to be able to explain, how did I come up with that number that I've designated as my property value? The third option that HUD provides is a little less easy to use in many instances, but it allows you to use the tax assessment for a market value of a comparable unit that's in post-rehab condition. So when might that work? Well, if you were, let's say you were running a homeowner rehabilitation program in a particular neighborhood where you had very similar units, and you had some units that you had already done and already had been reassessed for a current market value after you'd done that rehabilitation. You could use those as comparables and use that to determine what the market value was going to be for the unit that you were proposing to rehab. Not necessarily easy to be able to apply, particularly in a statewide program, but it is allowable in those limited circumstances. So that was property value after rehab. Now we have to talk about what level do we need to bring these units up to. I mentioned that every home assisted unit will have to be brought up to our property standards. So HUD itself has required ADFA to adopt written rehabilitation standards. And what these standards address are defining what's considered a health and safety violation. So what things would have to be addressed as part of every rehab standard if it was found to be existing in that unit. Also, setting a useful life of major systems. HUD themselves have set this at a minimum of 5 years. So as part of your assessment, you would be determining, does the furnace, does it appear to have a useful life remaining of 5 years or more? If not, we're going to include replacement of that component within my scope of work. So that would include all the major systems, the roof, the structure itself, plumbing, electric, HVAC, all of those systems would be assessed as part of that process of determining what's the required scope of work to bring that property up to standards, and you would be following the ADFA written rehabilitation standards. As part of that, ADFA standards would identify anything that was considered life-threatening deficiencies, and those would always have to be addressed immediately if you had an occupied unit. Also keep in mind that the lead-based paint requirements apply with the use of our home funds, which are federal funds. Those regulations are at 24 CFR Part 35. So if we have a unit that was constructed prior to 1978, then there is the possibility that there is lead paint within that unit. And so we're going to have to follow the requirements of completing a risk assessment on that property and determining what lead remediation or hazard reduction work needs to be done as part of our scope of work, and that will be included in our assessment. Accessibility requirements may also apply, and we are all, of course, going to try to make sure that our units are made accessible for the needs of the occupants. And then HUD requires that in disaster-prone areas, that if there are disaster standards in place, that those also be applied to properties when we're rehabbing them. So Arkansas, prone to tornadoes, if there are building specifications that have been put in place to try to protect units from damage from future tornadoes, that would be something that ADFA could adopt within their written rehabilitation standards to then try to make sure that as part of rehabbing these units, we try to protect them from future damage. So the ADFA standards that are in place, all of the rehabilitation projects will have to meet ADFA's written standards and the state and local codes. If there was no state or local code that applied, then HUD would require that ADFA put in place either the International Existing Building Code or the International Energy Conservation Code. When the units have been completed, they will have to be free of deficiencies based on HUD's Uniform Physical Condition Standards, and that's at 24 CFR 5.703. I will note that presently we are waiting on additional guidance from HUD on how that standard will be applied to the home program. And then, of course, any health or safety issues, any life-threatening deficiencies must be addressed immediately if that housing is occupied. So we could have a unit that we inspect and determine we're going to assist that has, I don't know, some kind of a electrical hazard as part of that. We might need to address that immediately up front on an emergency basis and then follow with the rest of the scope of work for that unit if we've got an occupant that is in danger based on that current situation. The requirements for the Property Standards Rehab include ADFA's Construction Performance Manual, and specifically looking at sections 1 and 2, the Arkansas Energy Code, the International Code Council, ICC, and then keep in mind that you also would have to meet any applicable state and local property standards or codes. So in some communities, you will have additional standards or perhaps higher standards than what the other would require. You need to be in compliance with zoning requirements, and then again, as we mentioned, disaster mitigation and handicap accessibility requirements. As part of this, the rehabilitation standards need to be met, health and safety, the major systems and their useful life. And we've already mentioned the UPCS standards, Uniform Physical Condition Standards, and lead-based paint. ADFA has a requirement in place for homeowner rehabilitation that all manufactured housing needs to be affixed to a permanent footing. So if you were to inspect a potential property that was going to be applying for home assistance, if it's a manufactured housing unit and it is not currently affixed to a permanent footing, you would need to include that in the scope of work to determine whether this was a unit that could be assisted with your program. HUD itself does not impose a long-term affordability for homeowner rehabilitation. ADFA has chosen also not to impose long-term affordability or other occupancy requirements for owner-occupied rehab. As we mentioned earlier, this has been designed as a grant program. We do not have liens in place. We are not recording liens. And so without a long-term affordability requirement, once that project has been completed, when it has met the property standards, we are done with that project and don't have essentially long-term tracking and reporting. So it keeps this type of activity much simpler to be able to undertake. The forms that you would be working with as part of implementing a homeowner rehabilitation activity, there is an ADFA homeowner rehabilitation application that would need to be completed. You would be using the ADFA owner-contractor agreement, which will lay out those terms. Also, an agreement between the eligible recipient and the homeowner. You're required to conduct a pre-construction conference, and there's a pre-construction conference record form to be able to use to capture the information and who attended and participated in that conference. And then there's a construction performance manual, which assists you to guide you through the oversight as part of that. ADFA has provided a work write-up template for the home program. So as you're inspecting that unit and determining the work that needs to be included in that scope of work, you can use the work write-up template that is available as part of the ADFA forms. There's a home inspection checklist, and of course we're going to be inspecting the progress of construction, but also at the point that we have a contractor either saying that they are ready for a draw or that they consider the project to be complete. We're going to be utilizing the inspection checklist. And also there are standard certifications for plumbing, electric, HVAC, forms to use for sign-off on the release of liens on the property, and also for the final inspection. All of these forms are available at the web address that's listed here, and that would all be part of your standard file that you would have in place for each of these applicants. You're able to document, we have an income eligible household, we have a unit that based on the proposed scope of work, the work completed, and the inspections would be shown to have brought up to those property standards. Very important to build that documentation and be able to document your compliance for your project.